we're going to go ahead and get started. And for those that are watching online, you might see us interact a little bit differently because we do have some people in the audience too. And of course, so this meeting is going to be streamed on our Facebook and YouTube page as well. But we'll start with just a welcome and a few introductions. Of course, this is our third public hearing for Module 3 of our Unified Land Development Ordinance. My name is Garrett Spradlin. I'm the city manager. And just to kind of remind people what we're doing is we're updating our land use regulations and subdivision standards. These were last touched in 1964. And so I think as we've reminded a lot of people over the time, a lot's changed since 1964. And we kind of want to make sure that we're updating and being a little more flexible with that. Module 3, as we go through today, is about the administrative procedures, how to deal with the boards and commissions, and what the procedure is for applying and developing in the city. So this is the third phase of what started with a comprehensive plan update for the city. And we have been working with our consultant, King & Keys Collaborative, through all of those, and including this module. So the rest of this presentation will be handled by Brian Mabry, who's our lead contact on this part of our project with King & Keys. So I'll turn it over to Brian and let him go from there.
Thank you, Garrett, and thanks for the in-person attendees and for the people who are joining us on Facebook. Let me get the PowerPoint moving. Can you adjust that?
I've got to click. That should work now.
So this is the third module of the Unified Land Development Ordinance. There have been obviously 2 modules before this one that were probably a little more engaging or interesting than this one. This is pretty dry. It is about procedural matters, how different applications are reviewed and acted on by city staff. Non-conformities or grandfathering is another big part of this module. Enforcement and remedies and violations and penalties and those kind of pleasant things. And then there are a couple of items related to definitions that we also have in this module, rules of construction and the actual definitions. We also have a development guidebook that is part of this project, which is a more user-friendly version of a lot of the content that is in Module 3. And there are hard copies here at State Hall, and they will eventually, of course, be available online as well. And then when I'm done, if there are any questions or comments, I'm happy to take them. There's also some posters up here that those in attendance can look at when I'm done also. So this firm, King & Keys, has been involved with Borger for some time doing a set of plans, a comprehensive plan, a downtown plan, and a parks plan. And now we're doing sort of the final aspect of this whole big project, which is the Unified Land Development Ordinance. And you might wonder what the differences are between those first 3 projects that had plan in their names and then this, which has ordinance in its name. So think of the first 3 as sort of like a menu at a restaurant, where there are different meals set up and prices and pictures of them, but there's not any background on how they're made or what goes into them or how long they take to cook. It's just what the person eating there can pick from to eat. But a ULDO is more like a cookbook for that restaurant. It has details. If it were a cookbook, it would be talking about the kinds of ingredients that go into the dish and how long it's cooked and stuff like that. In the ULDO, it has standards in it that kind of bring to life the policies that are set forth in those 3 plans we were working on. So a plan, like a comprehensive plan, might say that in the future, Borger wants to grow more affordable housing and have more affordable housing. That's sort of a broad goal that doesn't have much detail to it, but the ULDO can have things in it like smaller lot sizes or other kinds of housing types like duplexes or triplexes or single family that are smaller, that help to push forward that goal of having more affordable housing in the city. And that's just an example. It's not necessarily a recommendation that is in the plan here. So some things that a unified land development ordinance is, and then I'll have a slide that explains what it is not. It is combining two of your chapters that are in your city code, chapter 10 subdivision and chapter 14 zoning. Subdivision, chapter 10 has to do with how new, especially residential subdivisions, are laid out in terms of their lots, their streets, their sidewalks, their utilities, and stuff like that. Chapter 14 zoning is about land uses, how private property is used, what kind of parking is required, what kind of screening is required, and so on. So some of the advantages of having a ULDO are that it removes inconsistencies. When you put these two documents together, chapter 10 and chapter 14, inconsistencies and contradictions become more apparent. An example of that would be that we often see come to light is the definition of a street. The zoning ordinance will have a definition of what a street is, and a subdivision set of subdivision regulations will have a definition of the word street, and almost always they're not consistent with each other. And so when we mesh them together, those kinds of things become more obvious. A ULDO, keyword being unified, is a single source for standards and procedures and definitions related to land development in the city. It makes things simpler for staff to interpret and to enforce and administer, and it also helps the public in user-friendliness aspects with having illustrations and tables as opposed to too much legalese that's hard to understand. So some things that a ULDO is not are on the current slide now. It's not a property tax policy, so it doesn't set the taxable value of any property within the city or set a tax rate. It's not annexation policy either, so it doesn't forecast forward what lands outside of the city limits should be annexed in the future. It's also not a capital improvements program, so it doesn't set out a schedule and a budget for extending streets or extending utilities or widening streets or improving utilities or anything like that. It's also not the building code. It can affect where a building is placed on a property in terms of its setbacks and how tall that building can be, but it doesn't relate to the HVAC in the building, the electrical, the plumbing, and those kind of things. It's also not construction standards, so it doesn't set dimensions for curb and gutter. It doesn't set the composition of street base and sub base and those type of things. And finally, it's not a property maintenance or nuisance code. It doesn't require a property owner proactively to clean up their property if it is a nuisance or has problems with it that need fixing. It can have some incentives that help a person redevelop their property and take care of it that way, but it doesn't require a property owner to clean up their property. Here's the overall schedule of the project. Started back in October of 2020 with several kind of kickoff activities, and moved forward into our current phase, which we're just about to end, which is the drafting phase. And then we will be moving on in March and May to public review and comment, where we'll provide staff with a sort of consolidated public review draft of the ULDO, which they will go through and we will go through as well and fix any inconsistencies that might be in there, because we're kind of putting these three modules together into one document, and then we head toward adoption in June of this year. Like any ordinance, it has to go to the Planning and Zoning Commission. Any land use related ordinance, at least, has to go to the Planning and Zoning Commission for a public hearing and for their recommendation to the City Council, who then can adopt it as they see fit. So The city council will have the final say in what is contained in the ULDO. And so that's all part of the process. Nothing is written in stone and nothing is permanent until it's adopted, and even then it can be changed through the right public process. This shows you the contents of the previous modules, the two previous modules and this module. The first module was about the zoning districts and the land uses. Any city that has zoning has zoning districts within it that say what kinds of land uses can go where in the city and how tall those buildings can be and what kinds of parking and landscaping and signs they can have. The second module was sort of site design and subdivision standards. And then the third one that we're in now, again, is the development review procedures and administration. There are several what we call administrative bodies set up in the ULDO, and it's not that different from what you already have. City Council, Planning and Zoning Commission, Board of Adjustment, Director of Planning, City Engineer, and Floodplain Administrator. And as you can see, the Director of Public Works doubles as the City Engineer, and the Director of Planning doubles as the Floodplain Administrator. We like to be very clear in our codes about who is making a decision instead of just saying the city shall approve or may approve a sign permit. We say the Director of Planning may approve the sign permit, just so that it's clear who's making that decision for a person who's submitting an application that might be the only time they ever do anything like that in their lives, and it's totally Greek to them, so we want to make things as clear as we can. There are administrative provisions in this document that are sort of a catch-all for a lot of different things, and I won't go through each of those probably, but just several different kind of housekeeping aspects that the ULDO handles. One of those, let me go back one of those bullets has to do with annexation. The final bullet, designation of newly annexed territory. So, there's the city limits around the city, and then outside of the city limits is the extraterritorial jurisdiction. The city, under some pretty strict now state laws, can annex parts of lands outside of their city limits. And so the question becomes, what would the zoning of those newly annexed properties be? And we would rely on the comprehensive plan that was adopted a year and a half or so ago. So in this example, and this is a fairly random example, I think I called out the county airport when I did this, but let's say that's the city limit lines, and that dark line that kind of makes a rectangle at the bottom. If the city were to annex, and this is just purely hypothetical, but if they were to annex that blue area, then it wouldn't come in as agricultural like some cities do. They just annex it as agricultural and let the property owner change the zoning. It's a little more proactive than that. It's annexed as whatever the closest zoning district is to that future land use recommendation. Probably another example that I could have used is that subdivision to the west of where the city limit line makes a 90-degree angle on the left. That one, if that subdivision were ever annexed, it would be one of the low-density residential zoning districts there, because that's the closest to what the future land use map calls for that area. So there are 4 different types of applications in the third module of the ULDO. The first 3 on the slide you could sort of think of as the 3 branches of the federal government, with the administrative being like the executive branch, the legislative being like the legislative branch or Congress, and the quasi-judicial being like the Supreme Court and the lower federal courts below it. Then the subdivision one, the 4th one there, is its own thing that doesn't have really a comparison in the federal structure. But each application fits in with each of those types of things there. Administrative is staff decisions like permits for signs and for buildings and for other things like that. Legislative is decisions and applications that the city council makes a decision on. So the bigger picture things, the more impactful community-wide aspects like rezonings and special use permits. Quasi-judicial are appeals and variances where the Board of Adjustment makes a decision on whether to, for example, allow, if someone disagrees with a decision that was made by a city staff member in like denying a permit or approving a permit, they can appeal that decision to the Board of Adjustment. And the Board of Adjustment almost acts like a mini court and makes a decision on whether that decision by the city staff member was appropriate or not. And then subdivision decisions are actions related to final plats, replats, minor plats, and some other types of subdivision activities that are in the ULDO. This just gives a little more detail on what I kind of just said on the different types of applications that are in each of the four types of decisions. There's a set of common review procedures that probably won't go into too much, but it just consolidates procedural elements instead of having them a little more scattered like would have been in an older code like your current one, puts them all in one place so that it's, we think, easier to understand what requests require a public hearing, what requests require a recommendation by one group of people and then a decision by another group of people, things of that nature. Something very important is to make sure that the city staff gets complete applications, so they're not wasting their time reviewing incomplete applications that are just sort of thrown together. So if someone wants to submit a preliminary plat, there are 4 things that they need to have, generally speaking, in order to have a complete application. First is that the application is filled out, the actual application, and there are applications in the development guidebook that we've had in a draft form here, that their application's filled out, that any documents that are needed have been prepared by the right people. So plats generally have to be drawn up by a licensed surveyor, so there would need to be a check that has been done, that there's a seal on the drawing by a surveyor, that the fee for the application has been submitted, and that any other information necessary for compliance with the ULDO has been provided. And that could come to light when there's like a pre-application conference. Some of the bigger picture procedures, again, like a rezoning or a special use permit, require or at least suggest and encourage a pre-application meeting with city staff so that city staff kind of knows what's coming up down the pipeline, and the city staff can kind of tell the applicant, you know, here might be some potholes or hurdles that you might need to be looking at for what you're looking at doing on this piece of property. So those extra pieces of information for that 4th bullet there often would come to light when there is a pre-application conference. So grouping these together, as I kind of already said, grouping these procedural items together, sort of the advantages are sort of like having the ULDO itself, cuts down on duplications and inconsistencies, makes things very clear as far as what the decision criteria are that the staff is considering when they approve or disapprove a submittal, or the city council or P&Z or Board of Adjustment even. It just clarifies roles and responsibilities and procedures into something that is, we think, more clear than what you currently have. This is a key table for Module 3, and it's in one of these posters here. This one has the entire table on it, that it shows each of the development applications that are addressed in the ULDO. Shows each of them, and then in the next column, that's in the first column, that next column has any applicable standards. So for a sign permit, there's a reference here to the sign standards that would go along with someone applying for a sign permit. So those sign standards say how big a freestanding sign can be, in area how big it can be, and height how big it can be, where it could be on the property as far as setbacks, stuff like that. There's a timing column here, which in some things it's sort of obvious, like for a sign permit, it would be you would need a sign permit prior to actually installing a sign. In other requests or other applications, it's not quite as clear, so this clarifies that of why you would need a preliminary plat, or why you would need a final plat or a replat or whatever. The next column is expiration, and it shows when one of these applications, each of these applications expires if nothing is done. So if someone gets a sign permit and never builds the sign, then that sign permit expires in 2 years. So they've got plenty of time to put their sign up, but if they don't, then they'll have an expired application after 2 years. Some things never expire, like a rezoning. Once a property is zoned, then it doesn't change. If they never do anything on that property that they had a rezoning for, it doesn't go back to what it had been if they never build their project there. It just stays until someone else wants to rezone it, or that same person wants to change the zoning to even something different. So that's what the expiration column does. And then those final 2 columns show who makes a recommendation and who makes a final decision on all of them. So many of the more bigger picture items, like a text amendment to the actual ULDO or a rezoning or a special use permit, have a recommendation from the Planning and Zoning Commission, and then the final decision is by City Council. So it's all there in one spot. You don't have to look through paragraphs of information to try to figure out who makes a decision on these kind of things. So I think it's very handy. Non-conformities is the next kind of big topic, and that should say types of non-conformities, not types of conformities. A lot of people call this grandfathering, so there are different kinds of non-conformities that could arise when rules change. So a good example might be in a residential district, a commercial business being there, so that you have residential zoning all around. There's a property that has been there a long time that is a business, and sometimes that can be a good thing because it serves, you know, the residents in a convenient location, but sometimes it's not as good. And so that would be an example of a non-conforming use, where that land use was there before the property had that residential zoning. So it can keep going and keep being in place. It doesn't have to proactively be disbanded, but it can't intensify its use, so it can't have a larger building, generally speaking, or have a larger parking area. It's sort of sealed off in time to where it can't do much else, and the concept is that eventually it will kind of by attrition go away, theoretically. Often that does happen, but sometimes it doesn't. Non-conforming structures are another one where, say there was a side setback of 10 feet that was required somewhere, but the building has been there forever and is really only 5 feet from the side property line. So that building, if it were, it could be expanded in the future, but it would have to meet that 10-foot setback on the side rather than being built continually along that 5-foot setback where it currently is. So there is some wiggle room in there and flexibility for uses and structures and lots and signs and other features when they're not conforming, but generally they have some parameters set on them where they can't expand. There are, but as I was just saying, there are some written, and they're not loopholes because they're there on purpose, but there are some written ways around to be able to maintain and you know, continue to have a good-looking site, even if it is a nonconformity. But there are, again, these controls on it when it comes to expansion. There is an article that relates to violations, penalties, and remedies. So violations, and most cities, as I said this morning, when it comes to enforcing their zoning regulations, they just want compliance. They're not trying to get a bunch of fees racked up for property owners. They just want eventually to, and usually there's multiple chances to comply, multiple warnings before it escalates beyond that. But there is, you know, eventually going to be violations of, you know, your current zoning ordinance or your new ULDO, where and this article spells out that process for having a violation and what are some things that the city can do to try to encourage compliance. There's withholding permits for that property owner. If they were to try to have any other permits for anything, they wouldn't be able to get them until they fix their violation. Stop work orders, cease and desist. There's, you know, a lot of legal remedies that don't involve yet going to court. But there is the option of going to court eventually if something is bad enough and there's just none of the non-judicial remedies are working, then there is the option for the city to take that landowner to court. And then a judge ends up deciding what the penalties should be. But there are some, a section in your city code about penalties and what they should be. Getting toward the end, there are rules of construction and definitions in Article 14.09. This is sort of like definitions, but not quite, where it describes the difference between something like shall versus may, where shall is mandatory. If it says that the planning director shall do something, then that's a requirement. If it says that the director of planning may do something, then that's not a requirement. And versus or in a list of things, that can make a large difference. If you say the applicant shall A, B, C, and D versus the applicant shall A, B, C, or D, explaining those differences between and or. Delegating authority, so if we said the planning director shall do this and the planning director shall do that, that would make him a very busy person. That also means their staff can go out and do inspections or make decisions on certain permits instead of the actual literal planning director doing all those things. There's a piece about rounding of numbers, especially when it comes to parking. You could get in a situation where if there's one space required per 300 square feet of a building, then you could end up requiring 10.7 parking spaces, and so obviously you're going to round that to the 11 parking spaces, and so that just makes that very clear in black and white. And another one, there's more than just these, but how days are calculated. The assumption is that we're talking calendar days as opposed to work days, unless it states otherwise in the specific language where days are mentioned. So all these things help clear up what the meanings of different words are. And then there's the conventional just sort of definitions where there are terms of art, we call them, where certain things that an average layperson who doesn't eat and sleep and breathe zoning every day isn't going to know what is meant, you know, by like bed and breakfast, or that's a pretty common term, but just these terms that we have in there that aren't everyday terms that most people know. Development guidebook real quick. It's a very user-friendly guide for the procedures that I've been talking about. It has a lot of flow charts in it, so graphics and tables, and very easily worded so that it's understandable. There's a view of some of the flow charts and tables. It's also got all of the applications in it as well for the different procedures that I've been talking about, and they're on that table there. This morning, here's the kind of schedule and next steps. This morning I talked to the city council with staff also in the room and went over this module. We're doing the open house right now. Tomorrow I'll be meeting in the morning with the Ordinance Advisory Committee to talk about Module 3. They are sort of a group of citizen advisors who are providing input on this project. And then when we get into mid-April, we'll be providing to city staff a public review draft of all 3 modules put together. And then there'll be another trip for me at the end of May to have a discussion and presentation on that public review draft. And I think that about wraps it up. And if there are any questions, I'd be happy to try to answer them, or I don't know if there's any online questions, but we'll see.
Yeah, nothing online yet. That's what's nice about that, is they can, as people have time to watch it, they can ask questions. Of course, this, kind of like he said, this module isn't the most enthralling with changes, but for staff, and probably some of the board members here, this one is one of the more exciting to me, because we do kind of clarify some of those procedures that aren't always easily understood or clear cut, and with the guidebook, I think that's important. as we get back to the final review and work everything in, you know, I will say that a lot of what we're changing, they're not drastic, massive changes to the rules and land uses from where they are. It's more modernizing word choice, modernizing organization, and then, yes, modernizing some of the regulations, but generally, in a lot of ways, it's making it a little more flexible. Like, you know, especially in subdivision regulations, we talked about this a little bit, but there's like some averaging ability. So lot size doesn't have to be absolute if the majority of the lots of the subdivision comply. And so as we talk about addressing housing shortages and things like that, that becomes important to where our current code now is it shall be exactly this every lot regardless. And so we're kind of excited, I think, for some of those changes. As we get a little closer, what the public hasn't really seen yet is how this is going to interact with our GIS map layer and the ability to find your lot, click on the lot, see the zoning, link to all the codes and regulations. So when a prospective developer is interested, or even a homeowner wants to know what they do, it makes it a much more usable. And, you know, I'm educated in government, and the code right now is not always the most educated, but we're excited about those changes. And there will be a lot more pushed out on social media, a few more meetings coming forward before we actually adopt this. And we talk about changes and things like that, but I will remind everybody that the number one goal when we were revising all of this is to produce the fewest amount of non-conformities possible. So this isn't massive change and going to drastically change what you can do with your property. It's just kind of making it modernizing. And an example of that is if any of y'all like to go to Alls, our existing code did not have any provisions for a microbrewery. So we had to work around that. We had provisions if Anheuser-Busch wanted to come build, you know, if they wanted to move out of St. Louis and build their full-size brewery here, we had provisions for that, but we didn't have provisions for a microbrewery. And with some of the other changes that are coming, you know, that's really what's driving this for us. But if there are any other questions, then, you know, we just invite you to keep paying attention to the city social medias, websites. You know, we do publish all these in the newspaper generally as well, so just kind of keep up, and there'll be more opportunities for public engagement going forward. But I appreciate those that came, those that came this morning, and those that will come tomorrow. That feedback is important to us. So we will see y'all at the